Hello and welcome to today's session. I am Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha, Professor in Department of Physiology, Rashtriya Dashrath Autonomous State Medical College, Ayodhya. And the topic for today is mechanics of breathing. I would be discussing today's session under the following headings, which will be, first of all, the anatomy of respiratory system. Then we'll talk about few pressures which act in and across the thoracic cavity. Then we'll discuss about mechanical properties of the lung and chest wall. And finally, what are the mechanics which are involved in breathing? Then few lines about role of surfactant, and finally the applied aspect of today's topic. So first of all, coming to respiratory system. As you all know, we all live, the cells of all the body live in an internal milieu, which is called as the internal environment of the body. This internal environment of the body is very important for sustainability of life, which is requirement of glucose, temperature, pH, osmolarity, and one of the most important constituent of this internal milieu is availability of oxygen at the level of tissues. So to make this oxygen available at the level of tissues, our respiratory system are working continuously. So we take oxygen from the external environment and we throw out a waste metabolite which is produced during metabolism, which is carbon dioxide. So the function of this respiratory system is to provide a constant supply of oxygen to all the tissues in the body. Coming to the anatomy of respiratory system, it starts from the nose, then from nasopharynx, oropharynx, pharynx, it reaches to trachea. Trachea is a conduit which helps in the transportation of gas from the external environment into the lungs. Trachea further goes down and divides into right and left bronchi, which further divides into secondary and tertiary bronchi, finally going into terminal bronchioles, which open into alveolus. Alveoli are the functional unit of the respiratory system. As you can see in this diagram, the trachea, which is this long conduit tube, it is going down and it is divided into right and left bronchi, which further divides into different bronchi, and it finally goes and open into the alveoli. The lungs basically are inside the thoracic cavity, but between the thoracic cavity and lungs, there are very important structures which are called as pleura. There are two layers of pleura. The one which is closer to the lungs, next to the lungs to the viscera, are called as visceral pleura. And the one which is next to the visceral pleura towards the thoracic cavity, it is called as parietal pleura. There is a potential space between parietal pleura and visceral pleura, which is called as pleural cavity. This pleural cavity is very important because it contains a fluid called as pleural fluid, which makes sure there is a frictionless and proper rubbing between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. Now, inspiration is an active process which happens due to the contraction of inspiratory muscles, which are mainly diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Normal expiration, which is a passive process which happens because of relaxation of these muscles. It happens due to the elastic recoil of lungs. Muscles responsible for forceful expiration are internal intercostal muscles, sternocleidomastoids, pectoralis muscles, and abdominal muscles. Now, once again, I want to show you this diagram, which again shows the various segments and lobes of the lung. You can see there is a trachea, which is connected to the right and left lungs, and there is a muscle which is at present at the base of lungs, which is called as diaphragm. The lungs are covered by visceral pleura and parietal pleura. Visceral pleura is closer to the lungs and it is tethered or attached to the lungs. Parietal pleura is attached to the chest wall of the inner of the chest wall of the thorax. Now, before going to the mechanics of breathing, I want to share with you a few important pressures which act across the respiratory system. Now, you all know from your physics, from your class 12th, that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So there has to be certain pressures which must play a role in this movement of air within the respiratory system and out of the respiratory system. The most important layer pressure which we'll talk about is the atmospheric pressure, which is at the level of C. So this pressure is called as atmospheric pressure, and this is around 760 millimeters of mercury. Because we are talking about sea level, if we go above sea level, that is pressure will go up, and if we go below level, pressure will go down. So the sea level is a zero level, and below it, above it is a plus or minus. So atmospheric pressure is also called as zero pressure. Then the second pressure is intra-alveolar or intrapulmonary pressure. Because your respiratory system is in continuation with the atmosphere outside, so there is no demarcation between the atmosphere and the respiratory system. So the pressure in the atmosphere is same as that of the intra-alveolar or intrapulmonary pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. Then between the pleura, between the parietal pleura and visceral pleura, the pressure is called as intrapleural pressure, which is less than the atmospheric pressure, which is around -4, which comes to be around 756 millimeters of mercury. Then we'll talk about a very important law, which is Boyle's law, which is very important to determine the pressure inside the respiratory system. So now, how there is a difference in the pressure, we'll talk about this. Okay, so to understand better how these pressures work, we have to understand certain forces which are acting in the respiratory system. So the first force is the elastic recoil of the lungs. What is elasticity? Elasticity is the property of a material by virtue of it resists any change in its original shape. So the lungs have a tendency to collapse. They have an inherent tendency to collapse because of this elasticity. So there's a constant force which is acting on the lungs, which is trying to collapse the lung inside. Okay. Then the second force is the surface tension. Again, the surface tension also is a tension which appears on the interface of air and water. Whenever air and water they meet, there is on the surface of the interface, there is a pressure which is called as surface tension. Again, by the virtue of the surface tension, the alveoli tries to collapse. So there are two forces which are trying to collapse the lung. But there is a third force, which is the recoil of chest wall, which is moving outwards, which is trying to expand the chest wall. So basically, two forces are trying to collapse the lungs, and one force is trying to move the lungs towards the outer side. So these three forces are acting in a different direction and trying to move visceral pleura and parietal pleura away from each other. Because visceral pleura and parietal pleura, they are moving away from each other. Because they're moving away from each other, there's a potential increase in the volume in between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. Because the volume increases, the pressure has to decrease. This is Boyle's law, which states that pressure into volume is equal to constant. So if the volume will increase, the pressure will go down. That's why the intrapleural pressure is subatmospheric, which is -4. In this diagram, we can clearly see that the atmospheric pressure is 0 millimeters of mercury or 0 centimeter of water. Now, the force which is shown in the red, this red arrow shows the elastic recoil of the chest, which is trying to move outside. And then the inward recoil of lung or the elastic tissues of lung, they are trying to move the alveoli in the opposite direction. Also, the surface tension is also trying to move towards the inward direction. So there is a potential space between the two forces, which is trying to increase the volume. Whenever this volume increases, the pressure goes down, which is Boyle's law, which states pressure into volume is constant. So we have understood that there are three important forces. The first one is the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. Then there is intrapleural. The second force is intra-alveolar or intrapulmonary pressure, which is same as that of atmospheric pressure. And the third pressure is intrapleural pressure, which is -4, which is subatmospheric because of three different forces acting on the lungs. Okay, so now after understanding these pressures, now we'll try to understand how expiration and inspiration happens. So as I have told you earlier that intrapulmonary pressure and atmospheric pressure is same, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. So if the pressure is same, air will not move in or neither it will go out because air has to move from high pressure to low pressure. So to increase the pressure inside, we have to stimulate certain muscles in our respiratory system. The most important muscle which has to be activated is the diaphragm. This diaphragm muscle is made up of skeletal muscles, and skeletal muscles are under the control of motor neurons. So the nerve which is supplying this muscle diaphragm is the phrenic nerve, which has a root value of C3, C4, and C5. Whenever the inspiratory neurons from the VRG, ventral respiratory group of neurons in the medulla, they stimulate this phrenic nerve. This nerve stimulates diaphragm, and diaphragm contracts. Whenever diaphragm contracts, it goes down certain level around 1 centimeter. So if in resting state, diaphragm is like this, whenever phrenic nerve is stimulated, it contracts and it goes down around 1 centimeter. Whenever diaphragm contracts and goes down, the rostral caudal diameter of the thoracic cavity increases. Please try to understand what is rostral caudal. Rostral means face, caudal means tail. So the rostral caudal diameter, this diameter goes up by 1 centimeter. So the intrathoracic volume increases whenever diaphragm contracts. One thing. Second, there are various nerves which arises from T1 to T12. T1 is thoracic 1 to T12. These are called as intercostal nerves. These intercostal nerves supplies intercostal muscles which are present between the ribs. Between rib 1, rib 2, rib 2, rib 3, rib 3, rib 4, these muscles are present. The muscle of importance is external intercostal muscle. These muscles originate from the lower surface of the upper rib and it inserts on the upper surface of the lower rib. And it has a direction like this. It goes downwards, medially, and forward. Okay, so whenever they contract, they lift the lower rib upwards. I will try to show it through a diagram. If I have it, you can see in this diagram that whenever the external intercostal muscles contract, they lift the lower rib upwards. For example, if you have a bucket and it has a handle. Okay, this is a bucket and this is a handle. So whenever external intercostal muscles contract, it lifts the lower rib like this, like a handle of the bucket. This phenomena is called as bucket handle phenomena. So whenever lower ribs get lifted, it increases the transverse diameter of the chest. So the transverse diameter is increased. Secondly, whenever this external intercostal muscle contract, they also lift the sternum like this. So like a handle of the water pump, sternum is lifted like this. So whenever sternum is lifted like this, it increases the anterior-posterior AP diameter like this. It increases. So there are three things happening. First, diaphragmic contraction, because of which rostral caudal diameter is increasing. Then because of bucket handle phenomena, transverse diameter is increasing. And because of water handle pump phenomena, AP diameter, anterior-posterior diameter is increasing. Because of increase in all these three diameters, the intrathoracic volume goes up. And when intrathoracic volume goes up, because of Boyle's law, intrathoracic pressure goes down. So if intrathoracic pressure or intrapulmonary pressure was 760 millimeters of mercury, as you can see in this diagram, it was 760 millimeters of mercury. So because of these three phenomena, because of constriction of diaphragm, because of contraction of external intercostal muscles, is increase in rostral caudal, increase in transverse, and increase in anterior posterior diameter, your intrathoracic volume goes up, and because of which intrapulmonary pressure goes down. From 760, it goes down to 759, and because of which pressure outside becomes more and pressure in the lungs become less, and air start moving from outside to inside, which is called as inspiration. I want to show that in a diagram. So because of this, air starts moving in and there is inspiration. Okay, and the air will keep moving in till the pressure inside becomes 760 millimeters of mercury. After which the inspiration stops, and now diaphragm relaxes and goes back to its original position. External intercostal muscles also relaxes, so the transverse diameter also goes down. Your anterior posterior diameter also decreases, because of which volume decreases. When the volume decreases, pressure increases, and pressure becomes 761 millimeters of mercury. So now the intrapulmonary pressure is more as compared to your atmospheric pressure. And now pressure, because of high pressure inside the lung, air will start moving from lungs towards the external environment. And this is how we breathe out. Okay. So again, just to summarize, due to contraction of diaphragm, there is increase in the rostral caudal aspect of the thoracic cavity. Because of contraction of external intercostal muscles, there is increase in the transverse and anterior posterior diameter of thorax. Increase in the volume. Because of this contraction, there is decrease in the pressure inside the lung, which is the intra-alveolar or intrapulmonary pressure. This decrease in pressure leads to movement of air from outside to inside, from high pressure to low pressure. This is the inspiration. Because of relaxation of diaphragm and external intercostal muscles, there is decrease in the intrathoracic volume. Whenever there is a decrease in volume, there will be increase in pressure, and the pressure will increase to 761. So now the intra-alveolar pressure is more as compared to atmospheric pressure, and the air will start moving from inside to outside, and that's how your expiration happens. Okay, the increase in the transverse diameter is because of the bucket handle phenomena, and increase in the anterior posterior diameter is due to the water pump handle phenomena. Now, I have told you earlier that whenever there is a interface of water and air we are breathing in, and water in the lungs are produced by type 1 pneumocytes. They have certain secretions which is fluidic in nature. So the alveoli has certain amount of fluid and also have air. So whenever there is an interface between air and water, the water molecules at the surface of this air-water interface try to collapse these alveoli, which is called as surface tension. To decrease the surface tension, there are certain pneumocytes which are called as type 2 pneumocytes. Type 2 pneumocytes secrete a chemical which is called as dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. These are amphipathic lipoproteins which removes the air-water interface, and whenever the water and air cannot interact, there won't be any surface tension. So in certain conditions in which type 2 pneumocytes won't secrete or don't secrete surfactant, this leads to collapse of lung, which is called as acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a disease which is seen in patients which don't have surfactant. The importance of surfactant is to decrease the surface tension by removing the interface of air and water, and this is how surfactant acts. The chemical formula of surfactant is mainly it is dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. There are also phosphatidylglycerol, and their neutral lipids are present in this surfactant. Proteins in certain amount, around 8% are present, which are albumin, immunoglobulin A, and apoproteins, and certain carbohydrates, around 2% are also present in the surfactant. Whenever there is just to summarize again, whenever there is an air-water interface, water tends to shrink to minimize the surface area. Type 2 pneumocytes, there are two types of pneumocytes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 are around 85 and type 2 are around 15%. So mainly they are type 1 pneumocytes. Type 2 pneumocytes have mainly function of to secrete surfactant, and type 1 pneumocytes are mainly the constitutional pneumocytes which make the alveoli. So type 2 pneumocytes secrete surfactant, which decreases the air-water interaction. By making a layer at the air-water interface, surfactant decreases the surface tension. Now coming to the applied aspect of today's lecture, there is a condition called as pneumothorax. As I've told you earlier, the intrapleural pressure is subatmospheric, which is around -4. So somehow if we puncture, if there is an injury, there is a stab injury, a knife has been put in the chest and it pierces all the way and goes into interpleural space. So now the interpleural space is in direct contact with the atmospheric pressure. So because the interpleural pressure is negative and atmospheric pressure is plus 760 and 756. So air will start moving from the atmosphere into the interpleural space. Because of this movement of air, there will be compression to the lung, and the lungs will collapse and the chest will fill with the air. This condition is called as pneumothorax. This is a very important condition, and patient can die also because of the compression of the lungs. Secondly, there can be the injury to phrenic nerve. If there is an injury to phrenic nerve, like damage to C3, C4, C5, or damage to the phrenic nerve during surgery or during any cancer which is compressing the phrenic nerve, this will lead to paralysis of the diaphragm. Diaphragm will not be able to contract, and if diaphragm will not be able to contract, which diaphragm is the major respiratory muscle, so there will be difficulty in breathing during the exercise or during the stress. But normal silent breathing will be present because the muscles of the external intercostal muscles. Then there's a condition called as Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a kind of ascending paralysis. It starts from the leg and it ascends upwards. So when it ascends upward, it can involve the respiratory muscles and it can lead to respiratory paralysis and death. Infant respiratory distress syndrome, again, I have told you earlier, it is because of deficiency of surfactant, which is dipalmityl phosphatidylcholine. If surfactant will be absent, the alveoli will collapse because of surface tension, leading to the condition called as infant respiratory distress syndrome. So to prevent this, we have to make alveoli not collapse. So we have to maintain a positive pressure, which can be done by positive pressure ventilation. There are certain machines like CPAP, BiPAP. These machines provide positive pressure and they keep the alveoli open and maintain them patent so that they don't get collapse. So for today's session, the take-home message is breathing in when we take air in or breathing out when we blow out the air. It happens due to the changes in the intrapulmonary pressure, and this change in the intrapulmonary pressure happens due to contraction of respiratory muscles, primary respiratory muscles, which are diaphragm and external intercostal muscles, which changes the intrathoracic volume. And because of change in this intrathoracic volume, pressure changes because there's a physiological principle, which is Boyle's law, which states that pressure into volume remains constant. So because of the change in the volume, pressure changes, and because of this change in pressure, air moves in or air moves out, which is called as breathing in or breathing out, inspiration and expiration. I hope today's lecture will be of great help to all the students which are trying to understand mechanics of breathing. Thank you and have a great day.